The phrase born again has been repeated so many times it lost its teeth. Stripped down to a bumper sticker, a church sign, a cultural signal. But the original concept, the one that existed before it became a slogan, describes something closer to a psychological demolition. And if you've ever gone through a genuine identity shift, you already know what demolition feels like from the inside. In the Gospel of John, a Pharisee named Nicodemus approaches Jesus at night. He's a religious authority, well-educated, respected. And Jesus tells him something that stops the conversation cold. Unless a person is born again, they cannot see the kingdom of God. Nicodemus takes it literally. He asks how a grown person can re-enter the womb. The response pushes him further into confusion. Born of water and spirit, flesh gives birth to flesh, spirit gives birth to spirit. The metaphor is layered, but the core mechanic is blunt. The person you currently are has to end. A different person has to begin. That sounds religious. It is, but the structure underneath it maps onto something psychologists have been documenting for decades. William James wrote about it in 1902. In The Varieties of Religious Experience, he catalogued cases of what he called the divided self, people whose inner life was fractured between who they were and who they felt they needed to become. The resolution, when it came, was sudden and total. One identity collapsed. Another took its place. James described it as the hot center of personal energy shifting from one set of ideas to another. The old aims, the old habits, the old emotional defaults, they didn't gradually improve. They were replaced. That word matters. Replaced. Modern psychology has its own framework for this. Researchers studying identity disruption, in addiction recovery, in trauma survival, in major life transitions, keep finding the same architecture. The person who emerges on the other side often describes their former self as a stranger. They use language that mirrors the biblical text almost exactly. I died, that person is gone. I had to let the old me go. So what's actually happening in the brain during these shifts? The self-concept, your internal model of who you are, what you value, what you're capable of, functions like an operating system. Every decision you make, every reaction you have, every relationship you build runs on that software. When the operating system is stable, life feels coherent. When it starts failing, when the gap between who you believe you are and what your life actually looks like becomes too wide, the system destabilizes. Psychologists call this self-concept discrepancy. You hold an image of yourself as a certain kind of person, then evidence piles up from your behavior, from your relationships, from the mirror. That contradicts that image. The tension builds. For some people, it builds for years. For others, the breaking point comes fast. And the breaking point is where the biblical metaphor gets precise. Being born again requires a death. The old self doesn't get renovated, it gets buried. The Greek word used in the original text, anothen, means both again and from above. The ambiguity is the point. The new self arrives as if from somewhere else entirely. Anyone who's survived a genuine identity collapse knows that feeling. The new version of you doesn't feel like an upgrade. It feels like a stranger who moved into your body and somehow knows the layout. 12-step recovery programs built their entire structure around this mechanism. Step 1 is admitting powerlessness, which is really admitting that the current self-concept has failed. The old identity, the one that believed it could manage, control, moderate, that identity has to be declared dead before anything new can grow. Sponsors in AA sometimes describe the process in language that could come straight from a sermon. Your best thinking got you here. You need a new mind. The parallel runs deeper than language. Developmental psychologists have documented what they call quantum change, sudden dramatic shifts in personality that remain stable over time. William Miller and Janet C. Barker studied these events and found something striking. The people who experience quantum change consistently described the moment of transformation as involuntary. They didn't decide to become different. The old self collapsed, and something else was already there, waiting. That involuntary quality echoes through the theological tradition. In Christian theology, being born again is described as an act of grace, something that happens to you, through you, but ultimately beyond your control. You can position yourself for it. You can create the conditions, but the moment of shift arrives on its own schedule. This maps onto what clinical psychologists observe in patients going through major therapeutic breakthroughs. Months of work, months of insight, months of understanding, and then one session, sometimes one sentence, cracks the whole structure open. The patient walks out different. The therapist didn't install a change, they cleared the debris until the ground underneath could finally surface. Consider what this means for how we think about personal change. The dominant cultural narrative says transformation is gradual. Small habits, 1% better each day. Incremental progress, and for surface-level adjustments, going to the gym more, eating better, reading before bed, that model works fine. But identity-level change? The kind where you look back at your former self and genuinely cannot relate to that person's decisions? That operates on a different logic entirely. The gradual model assumes continuity. You're the same person, just improved. The born-again model assumes discontinuity. You are a different person. The old one is gone. Critics point out that this framing can become an escape hatch, people claiming radical transformation while repeating old patterns under a new label. And they're right. The language of rebirth gets abused constantly. People announce new beginnings on social media every January. The announcement itself becomes the ritual, and the actual death of the old self never happens. The theologians had a word for this too: cheap grace. Genuine identity death is expensive. It cost you relationships that depended on the old version of you. It cost you comfort because the new self hasn't built routines yet. It costs you certainty because you're operating without the map you spent years drawing. The reason the biblical text uses birth as its metaphor and not, say, renovation or improvement is that birth is violent, messy, and irreversible. You don't get to go back. Psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski described a process he called positive disintegration, the idea that psychological growth sometimes requires the complete breakdown of existing personality structures. The breakdown itself is the mechanism. The suffering, the confusion, the loss of identity, these aren't obstacles to transformation. They are transformation happening in real time. Dabrowski argued that people who never disintegrate, who maintain a stable self-concept from adolescence to death, may actually be less psychologically developed than those who fall apart and reassemble. That's an uncomfortable idea. It suggests that the most stable-seeming people might be the ones who simply never grew past their first draft. And the people who look like they're falling apart might be mid-construction. The born-again framework captured this thousands of years before psychology had a vocabulary for it. A person must die to who they were. The death is real. The grief is real. And the new self, when it arrives, doesn't owe the old one an explanation. You've probably experienced a smaller version of this, a moment where you realized you'd outgrown a friendship, a job, a belief system, and the realization came with a specific kind of grief. The grief of losing someone who is also you. The old journal entries in handwriting you recognize, but a voice you don't. That's the territory the text is pointing toward. Scaled up. Taken to its logical extreme, the question the concept leaves behind is the one Nicodemus asked, and the one that still hangs in the air 20 centuries later. How can a person be born when they are old? The answer embedded in the metaphor is simple and brutal. The same way anyone is born. Through a passage that is narrow, painful, and absolutely one-directional.